Let's start off with an easy one, shall we? Asta in Honkai Star Rail is a fire buffer of the Harmony class. Now, if I were to give an analogy using a bird as a description for all of the Honkai Star Rail 4-star characters, my analogy for Asta is a penguin. On her own, she's cute, lovely, and everyone loves penguins, and she works best, of course, in a group, and she supports the entire group together as well. She buffs their speed, she buffs their attack, and also buffs their fire damage, making her a best-in-class support, especially for a fire main damage dealer, for example Hook, or maybe even Qingque. She also does a lot of fire break damage, making her a very well-rounded support that offers, even if you wanted to play her as a solo fire unit, offers very good weakness breaking of the fire element. Her VA, her English VA is also Mona for Genshin. With all this in mind, I definitely think that Asta is S tier, and I don't think anyone will really disagree. She did get a little bit of nerfs, quite heavy ones from CB2 to CBT 3, but I think overall her utility is still top tier. Next up, we have another really good character. We have Herta. She's very popularly known for her Kuru spins follow-up attacks by her Japanese VA, and she's an Ice AoE DPS character. Now, if I were to give her a bird as an analogy, she definitely would be a hummingbird. It's one of the only birds who can hover in flight, and is absolutely broken, as is Herta. She has follow-up attacks, her trademark Kuru or time to twirl, depending on which VA you're using. And what it does is when enemies drop below a certain HP, she does a follow-up attack regardless of whether it's her turn or not, or outside her turn order rather, and she does tremendous amount of damage that scales quadratically with the number of enemies, as she can keep spinning and spinning for the multiple enemies that drop below 50% HP. She's also CC resistance, and her Kuru just makes her really adorable, lovable. Everyone likes this character so far, very popular 4-star among the community already. She has been nerfed since CBT2 and could possibly see a little bit more nerfs going into her official launch. Not as broken as she once was when she was first released, but overall I still do think that players should abuse this kit. Really strong character, especially from the early to mid game. Definitely S tier for me. Natasha is an excellent character, and she is a physical healer, and there are only 3 healers in the game. My analogy for her will definitely be a kiwi bird, almost extinct and very rare. There are 3 healers only in the game, and Natasha is the only 4-star free character out of them. The other 2 being the new standard 5-star Bailu, as well as another character, a limited 5-star character, Luota. Now, she has an emergency button in her ultimate. When you press it, immediately she will heal the entire party for a certain percentage of her max HP. And also she has a cleanse in her skill, although it only cleanses 1, but it does increase her utility of her overall kit as well. In my opinion, the biggest downside is she doesn't really offer that much outside of healing, whereas other characters might even become, for example, Bailu might become a bit of a buffer, or Luota has a bit more offensive kind of kit, which gives like a pseudo lifesteal kind of element to him. Whereas Natasha doesn't really offer much physical weakness breaking with her attack. She does get some damage bonus at her Eidolon 6 from her max HP scaling, but other than that, she doesn't really do much outside of healing. But nonetheless, I still do think that she's an S tier. Most free-to-play characters will be using Natasha and should be using her as well. I think the risk to Natasha's rating is definitely if one day we do have a lifesteal set and characters do become more self-sufficient. But until then, I don't think her rating should be any less than an S tier. And now we have our first new character on this list, and we have Tingyun. And in terms of her kit, she's actually a lightning buffer by class, very similar to Asta. Both of them are for the Harmony class as well. My analogy for her definitely will be a messenger pigeon, a solid asset to people in the past, as well as being a very strong team player. She attacks buff, she also buffs energy, and also does a lot of sub damage with combined attacks. Provides self speed as well as with Eidolons, gives target speed as well, and also have very strong scaling with Eidolons all the way up to E6. She's one of the reasons why I rated Clara so highly, as I think that her energy battering as well as attack buffing for a character that doesn't really care too much about speed, definitely best in class, and she ages out over Asta of characters who don't even care about speed in the first place. Definitely an S tier in my opinion. I don't think most people will disagree. Buffer kind of units are very indispensable, and I think Tingyun is definitely a top-notch character. Next up, we have Sushang. Sushang is a physical single target DPS. She saw a little bit of nerfs from CBT2 to CBT3 as we done in a video. I'll link in the video card above, I'll put in the description somewhere. And sorry, I just had to do it. The analogy that I'm going to give her is definitely a chicken. She's independent with self-push with her ultimate, allowing her to act again after she casts her ultimate, which means that she can normal attack or use her skill ultimate and immediately attack again. Very solid character that has very strong physical break damage if you are not planning to run maybe Clara on the other side. She has a strong self-speed buff as well. Overall, you can just fit her into like most team comps, and she doesn't really need like an attack buffer or healer or shielder. She can pretty much be run quite independently with decent amounts of damage. Not as broken as before in CBT2, but definitely still a solid choice overall. She also has reduced aggro in the kit. When she drops below 50%, she also blocks a bit of aggression from the enemies. The main key downside for Sushang is not because of her fault on her own, but mainly because single target DPSs and DPSs in general just do tend to be power crept a little bit more than support counterparts. Overall, I rank her A+ tier, definitely a solid character, and she can also use the artifacts that once you finish with your physical MC, you can just shift your gear over to Sushang and she will just inherit the amounts while your physical MC maybe transforms to a fire MC later on and stuff like that. And next up we have Arlan. He's a lightning DPS unit who excels the lower HP he is and definitely has some tremendous multipliers. My analogy for Arlan is definitely like a peacock. Very good multipliers, very flashy, great for showcases, videos and stuff like that, but overall he's a very fragile unit and requires a little bit of babysitting. In my country, if you run over a peacock, you have to pay a huge fine, and it's very fragile of Arlan, and he competes with a lot of strong 5-star characters as well. B tier for Arlan. Serval is a lightning AoE DPS character who is actually a free character now that I think we've hit the 3.5 million pre-register signups. So she's a free character for everyone to use once the game launches. And my analogy for her is a nightingale, just because the singing of a nightingale matches with her whole thematic and really nothing more than that. Her attack stat in game is one of the best. The 652 attack stat of CBT3 is the highest of a 4-star and even triumphing quite a lot of 5-star damage dealers as well. Really solid character overall for a free character, and she also applies shock in an AoE to enemies as well. The biggest downside to this character is she competes even the moment the game launches with two limited 5-star characters, Kafka and Tingyun. Both of them are already AoE DPS lightning units in nature. But when you are up against such strong competition, if you are pulling for any one of these Kafka or Tingyun, likely Serval is going to be benched or even reserved to a more supportive role with lesser incentive for you to invest in her. Because of this, I rank her A tier. Next up, we have Hook. Hook is a fire single target DPS. Now my analogy for Hook is a duck, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So she has very strong multipliers, and also she's of the fire element, meaning she can make use of Asta's in a whole kit in terms of fire damage buffing, speed buffing and attack buffing. But the downside of being a fire element is a double-edged sword, and the downside really is you can really get fire damage, break damage from many sources like Asta as well as Fire MC. So it's really a double-edged sword, and very often most players won't be running a single mono element team all the way up to perhaps in late game where you really need a specialist set. She requires a lot of babysitting because her whole kit, and she's relatively slow, requires a lot of buffing and pushing as well to really see her value pop off. A sham shielding is also required too if you want to keep her alive. There are definitely plenty of alternatives, such as you have Sushang. I chose duck because duck and chicken are alternatives. Okay, whatever. But anyway, single target DPSs have heavy competition, and I think Hook does face the same thing, and that's why I'm going to rate her in A tier. Sushang is a much faster counterpart and also much more independent and offers a bit more diversification in terms of element. Next, we have Pela. Now Pela is a ice debuffer kind of unit, and in my opinion, the best analogy I have for her with a bird is definitely an owl. She has an AoE defense down, a stripping of enemy buff using her skill, although it's just one buff stripping, and she has a self battery in her tracers and eidolons. A very independent character who is very quick to often proc her AoE defense down element. For most of you who play turn-based games, you know that AoE defense down and AoE speed down are great controllers of enemies, as it just tremendously increases the amount of attacks that you dish out. She has very strong damage as well on her own. It has been relatively buffed a little bit relative to other characters who got massive nerfs, and I do see her as doing a pretty decent sub DPS or maybe a secondary damage dealer role as well on top of her debuffing role. Her biggest downside, in my opinion, is that she's a relatively late game character, not because defense down is weaker than attack down, but generally speaking, most players might choose to opt for Asta because they get her earlier on if they don't be lucky on gachas and stuff like that. And generally, attack down, attack up and speed up is universal across all characters, so Asta might edge out in the early game, whereas Pela really defense down only might be more favorable towards a slightly later game environment. Of course, it's your game and you can play in any way you want. Overall, I do think that she's an S tier character despite her being slightly late game, and if you're playing for a pretty long time, I do think that you will find great value in this character. Also, one of the only sources of AoE defense down in the game is a 42% percentage defense down, which is pretty insane as well. And next up we have Sampo. He's a Wind debuffer, Nihility class by classification, but I do think that he also can be classified as like an AoE DPS as well. In my opinion, the best analogy for him is really like a vulture. He likes long fights to stack up his wind shear a little bit more, and he excels in more of like a damage over time kind of scenario, and he also debuffs enemies in terms of them taking slightly more damage over time. Works well with characters like Kafka and other units who have damage over time, like maybe Hook's and Hunt State as well. In my opinion, he's hardly really a debuffer. This game likes to classify like damage over time as a debuff, but really to me, damage over time is more of like a AoE damage dealer or a damage dealer role rather than a debuff. I do think that debuffers in the traditional concept really talks about increasing damage of your team, reducing damage of the team or the enemies, or applying some kind of nerf to the enemy character. Not really much of like a damage over time in my opinion. There are many strong wind types in the game already, and many of them are already solid DPSs. He competes very strongly with the 5-star Blade as well, who is a much stronger AoE DPS in my opinion. I do think that he's an A tier. You could see him work in some situations, a really good controller against units like Svarog, especially in the early game if you're fighting that boss as well. And next up we have another new character, Qingque, Quantum Element, a rare element by nature and is classified as a DPS, a mix between AoE as well as single DPS depending on what state that she is in. In my opinion, the best analogy I have for her is really like a parrot, because you really need to have a slightly better grasp, and parrots are known to be smart birds. If you want to use this character, definitely you have to be in tune more with your timings as well as usage of your resources, because despite being a rare element, the only other two are limited 5 stars being Sealy as well as Silver Wolf, and she has very high damage with a very high 652 best in class attack stat together with Serval for a 4-star character. And as mentioned, her kit is slightly complex in nature, in a sense where you really need to manipulate the amount of skill gauges you use in terms of drawing the mahjong tiles to get the suits of a similar kind in order to dish out her maximum potential. Might not be very favorable for a new player to understand, or not as intuitive to get started and get going. But despite that, I still do think that she's an A+ tier, very strong damage dealer, especially if you can get her kit right. But she, in my opinion, has very low synergy with Asta because Asta also drinks up skill gauges, especially if she can't get the amount of stacks for her skill ability. Next up, we have Physical MC. Now, Physical MC is a physical DPS by classification, and in my opinion, the best analogy in terms of like a bird category, cheating a little bit, but it's definitely like a bird egg. The best benefits of Physical MC is that the character is free, you get to customize the character's gender, and is an investment for future. I don't want to talk about the downsides of this character because there are quite a lot of downsides versus, of course, the other 4 stars on the list as well. But the main reason why people are playing Physical MC is definitely to go into the other elements, and as well as for future when other elements are unlocked, when we have new regions and stuff like that. The rating for Physical MC, as you can kind of guess, I do think is a B tier for me. And now let's talk about the investment value, since we just talked about the Physical MC. And next up we have Fire MC. Now, no spoilers in this context, you will unlock Fire MC as you progress the story, but when you do, Fire MC is a tank and shielder of the fire element. And the best analogy I have for Fire MC is definitely like a phoenix rising from the ashes. In my opinion, the best benefits of this character is she is free, she or he is free, and has a very good solid shield as well for the entire team. Decent damage with very good fire break damage. Considering that this is a free unit, I did feel when I'm playing the game that you could actually get by with Fire MC for the most part, and even not require like a dedicated tank unit that is 5-star like Gepard, or even like a March 7 or something like that. You can just get by most content with Fire MC as well. In my opinion, For the fact that it's a affordable and free-to-play friendly character, definitely S tier. Very, very unique, being that normally Hoyoverse, in terms of like Genshin Impact, doesn't give good free characters for the most part. And next up, we also have another free character, and I saved the best 2 Astro Express crew for last. Now, March 7th goes first, and she is an Ice Shielder type unit in a similar classification of Fire MC. Both of them are Preservation class. And in my opinion, the best way to describe March 7 is she's definitely like the Birds of Paradise birds, and it's definitely something that you have googled before. So she draws aggro, she counters as a majority part of her kit, but one of the biggest downsides of her is that she's actually a single target unit in terms of her counters, and she's also rather split scaling. Single target also for the shielding that she provides, and it's very weak to like AoE enemy attacks, where if let's say you have multiple squishies, you really don't have the additional shielding to provide the whole entire team, especially when faced with an AoE enemy encounter. Overall, I do think that her rating is an A tier, definitely, but still definitely Bae, one of my favorite characters in the game for design as well. And now last but not least, we have Danheng. Now it's no surprise that I'm going to be rating Danheng a little bit higher than most, especially if you have seen the CBT2 changes to CBT3. He got massive buffs coming into CBT3, while most other meta characters actually got nerfs overall. And if you have seen the top DPS characters I put out last year, he was already second. And Danheng is still a wind type unit with its more of a classification as DPS, but in my opinion that he could also be a strong debuffing type unit as well. And my best analogy for Danheng is definitely like an eagle. He's free, in freedom of an eagle, and he's also strong damage and is very, very quick as well in terms of his stats. 100% movement speed down of the enemies if he crits, and he acts as a boss controller late game as well. So if he, for example, gets power creep by another wind type character, like maybe you pick up Blade or maybe you pick up Sealy, to be a single target shutdown kind of unit, he can always be rotated on to be a more secondary damage dealer as well as a boss controller, because he applies 100% speed down on the enemy when he crits. Solid boss controller and good diversification for your team. He scales with investment, as most of his Eidolons and his kit allows you to go build more into damage stats like crit rate, crit damage, speed, and also wind damage and stuff. He also is a wind element, so he has access to a very strong wind set as well. In my opinion, it's definitely S tier, possibly one of the characters that I highly recommend most people at least invest in your starting crew. You might want to consider investing in Danheng as well as physical MC in terms of levels, just to get started. But we will do all these in another video later on, and with that, I've come to the end of my 4-star tier list. If you like the format of this video, you might be interested in these other tier list videos right here. And just remember, tier lists are just pigeonholing for ease of learning, but every character is a good character if built right. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.